Welcome to Mindful Moments. Nourish your mind on the go. Our AI narration lets you delve into the wisdom of timeless books, extracting those golden nuggets of insight. Ready for a deep dive today? We're going way back in time to explore the history of infectious diseases.
Ooh, infectious diseases. Fascinating.
It is, and we're using this book, Pathogenesis, by Jonathan Kennedy, to guide us. He makes this really interesting argument that plagues have actually shaped human history even more than wars or like individual leaders.
Wow, that's a big claim. I'm intrigued.
Right. It kind of makes you rethink how we view history.
hmm
Like we usually focus on these big events or powerful people. But what if these tiny little pathogens had been the real driving force all along?
It's like a secret history unfolding right beneath our noses. I like it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And speaking of hidden narratives, Kennedy starts off by challenging this idea that Homo sapiens were alone in their dominance. We always hear about how we were the only human species to survive, but actually we share the planet with other human species like Neanderthals.
Right. Neanderthals. They were pretty sophisticated too, from what I've read.
Yeah, they were. And Kennedy suggests that Homo sapiens might have inadvertently played a role in their extinction.
Oh, really? How so?
Well, he proposes that Homo sapiens carried pathogens that these other human species had no immunity to. So, like, imagine, you have these groups of Neanderthals, and then Homo sapiens come along carrying all these new diseases that the Neanderthals had never encountered before.
So it's like an invisible weapon that they had no defense against?
Exactly. It completely changes our understanding of how Homo sapiens became the dominant species. And to illustrate this point, Kennedy uses the example of Cheddar Man.
Cheddar Man, who's that?
Oh, he was one of Britain's earliest inhabitants. They found his skeleton and did all this genetic analysis. And it turns out his hunter-gatherer ancestors were likely wiped out by diseases brought by migrating farmers.
Oh, wow. So disease really did reshape populations even way back then.
Yeah, it's a pretty stark example of that. And it kind of sets the stage for what Kennedy calls the first epidemiological revolution.
Okay, the first epidemiological revolution. Tell me more.
So this happened during the Neolithic Revolution, when humans transitioned from being nomadic hunter-gatherers to settled farmers. It was a huge turning point in human history, but it also had this unintended consequence.
Uh-oh. What was that?
Well, living in close proximity to domesticated animals exposed humans to all sorts of new pathogens.
Oh, right. Makes sense. We weren't really meant to be living in such close quarters with animals.
And these early farming communities were hit hard by these new diseases. Kennedy talks about how there were significant population crashes and setbacks.
I bet. Their immune systems wouldn't have been prepared for that kind of onslaught.
And one of the most devastating examples was something called the Neolithic Black Death. It was a plague pandemic that likely occurred around 5,000 years ago.
5,000 years ago. Wow. So plague pandemics weren't just a medieval thing.
Nope, they've been around for a lot longer than that.
Yeah.
And scientists have actually found evidence of Yersinia pestis, the plague bacteria in ancient skeletons, dating back to that period.
Really? That's incredible. And a little bit scary too, I guess.
Yeah, it is. It makes you realize that these plagues have been shaping our history for millennia. We tend to think of them as these isolated incidents. But Kennedy argues that they've had ripple effects throughout history, impacting everything from social structures to political power to even the rise of religions.
Hold on. How does he connect ancient plagues to the rise of religions? That sounds like a stretch.
Well, think about it. Imagine living through a devastating plague, like the one that ravaged Athens during the Peloponnesian War. We have Thucydides' account of it, and it's just horrific. People were dying left and right. The city was in chaos. There was so much fear and suffering.
Right. I can only imagine.
And in times like that, people often turn to religion for solace and meaning. They're looking for answers, for comfort, for hope.
So plagues create this kind of fertile ground for new belief systems to take root.
Exactly. Kennedy suggests that the Antonine and Cyprianic plagues, which significantly weakened the Roman Empire, also played a role in the spread of Christianity.
Interesting, because Christianity offered a message of hope and salvation, which would have been very appealing during those times of widespread death and uncertainty.
Right, it provided a sense of comfort in a world ravaged by disease.
That's a fascinating connection. It really makes you realize how deeply intertwined religion and disease have been throughout history.
It does, but it also highlights this incredible resilience of the human spirit. Our ability to find meaning and hope even in the darkest of times.
I agree. It's a testament to our strength as a species.
Absolutely. And this theme of resilience is central to Kennedy's whole narrative. He argues that while pathogens have undoubtedly shaped our past, They've also been catalysts for innovation and social change. And a prime example of this is the Black Death.
Ah, the Black Death. A truly horrific pandemic. We all know it was devastating, but can you talk about how it specifically reshaped Europe?
Well, the Black Death wasn't just about the staggering death toll. It also triggered these profound social, economic, and even technological changes. For instance, the massive loss of life led to labor shortages, which gave peasants more bargaining power and weakened the feudal system.
So it actually shifted the balance of power in society.
Yeah, in a way it did. And it also created a demand for new technologies like the printing press.
Wait, the printing press? How does that fit into all of this?
It's actually a fascinating example of how disease can incorrectly drive innovation. So the printing press was initially intended as a labor-saving device, right? Because there were fewer people to do the work of copying text by hand.
Right.
But it ended up revolutionizing the way information spread, and this in turn fueled the Protestant Reformation, as Martin Luther's critiques of the Catholic Church became more widely accessible thanks to the printing press.
Wow, so the Black Death indirectly sparked a religious revolution.
It's incredible how one event can have such far-reaching consequences. But before we delve into colonialism, I'm curious, what particularly struck you about the Black Death's impact on Europe?
One aspect that really stood out to me was the tragic scapegoating of Jewish communities. They were accused of poisoning wells and faced horrific violence. It's a stark reminder of the dangers of misinformation and fear during pandemics. Even in the face of a shared threat, societies can turn against each other.
It's a sobering thought, for sure.
It really is. And it makes you wonder how we can learn from these past mistakes to prevent such tragedies from happening again.
Yeah, it's a reminder that pandemics don't just expose our biological vulnerabilities, but also like the cracks in our social fabric. But let's shift gears now and talk about another dark chapter in human history, colonialism.
Colonialism, yeah. I mean, we can't really talk about colonialism without talking about the role of disease, right?
Absolutely. It wasn't just about military might or, superior technology. It was about these invisible forces, these pathogens that completely reshape the dynamics of those encounters. It's like a hidden factor that often gets overlooked in the traditional narratives of conquest.
Right, exactly. Kennedy challenges that whole guns and steel argument. You know, the idea that Europeans dominated simply because they had better weapons and technology. He's saying no, it was way more complicated than that. Pathogens played a huge role.
So how did disease specifically contribute to the European conquest of the Americas then?
Well, think about diseases like smallpox, measles, influenza. These were diseases that indigenous populations had no immunity to.
And they just ripped through the Americas.
Yeah, they spread like wildfire, decimating entire communities. It was devastating.
Kennedy's some pretty shocking statistic too, right? To really drive home the scale of the devastation.
Yeah, he talks about how the indigenous population of Mesoamerica, which was around 20 million before European contact, plummeted to just 1.5 million a century later.
It's hard to even fathom those numbers.
Yeah. It really highlights the power of these invisible invaders. And it's a tragic reminder of the unintended consequences of human interaction, right? You have these two groups of people who've been separated for millennia, and then they come into contact and it unleashes this biological catastrophe.
It's a sobering thought. And it wasn't just in the Americas either, right?
No. Kennedy also talks about the impact of diseases like malaria and yellow fever on European colonization of Africa. Africa actually became known as the white man's grave because so many European colonists succumbed to these diseases.
So in a way, you could say that pathogens actually acted as a defense mechanism, slowing down European colonization in certain regions?
Yeah, they definitely influenced the pace and dynamics of colonization. For example, the Congo region was notoriously deadly for Europeans. The mortality rates were incredibly high, even for those who survived the initial arrival. So it took much longer for Europeans to penetrate and control the interiors.
It's like nature was pushing back.
In a sense, yeah. It's a reminder that even the most ambitious imperial endeavors can be thwarted by these microscopic forces.
It challenges our whole perception of human dominance, doesn't it?
It does. It highlights the power of nature to disrupt our plans. And it leads to an important question, I think. If diseases played such a crucial role in shaping the course of colonialism, what lessons can we learn from this as we navigate a world that's becoming increasingly interconnected?
It's a question that's more relevant than ever today, right? With globalization, travel, trade, we're all so connected now.
Exactly. As we face new challenges like climate change and the emergence of novel pathogens, understanding the historical interplay between disease and human movement is crucial. We need to learn from the past to prepare for the future.
So let's move on to the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah.
a period of immense technological and social transformation. How did this era impact the relationship between humans and pathogens?
Well, the Industrial Revolution led to rapid urbanization. You had all these people flocking to cities for work, and cities just weren't equipped to handle that kind of population growth. So you ended up with overcrowding, inadequate sanitation, poor hygiene. And these conditions were perfect for the spread of diseases like cholera.
Cholera was particularly devastating, right?
It was. It's a severe bacterial infection that causes intense diarrhea and dehydration. And if left untreated, it can lead to death very quickly.
And it spread through contaminated water sources, right?
Exactly, which is why sanitation was such a huge issue during that time.
And that's where the work of Edwin Chadwick comes in, right?
Yes, Chadwick was a social reformer who really pushed for sanitation improvements in British cities. He was instrumental in getting things like water and sewage systems implemented.
And these measures had a huge impact on public health.
They did.
Yeah.
They dramatically reduced the incidence of cholera and other waterborne diseases.
So Chadwick's efforts show how important government intervention and public health infrastructure are in protecting populations from disease.
Absolutely. It's not just about individual responsibility. It's about collective action. It's about the role of the state in safeguarding the health of its citizens.
And this idea of collective action is something that's really relevant today, too. As we face global health challenges like pandemics and antibiotic resistance, it highlights the need for collaboration for shared responsibility in addressing these complex issues.
It's a crucial insight, and it leads us to this concept of modern plagues, which Kennedy defines as non-communicable diseases like heart disease, cancer, diabetes.
Modern plagues. That's an interesting term. So he's essentially saying that these chronic diseases are the new plagues of our time.
Yeah, and what's fascinating is that he links the distribution of these diseases to poverty and inequality. He argues that they're not simply a matter of individual lifestyle choices, but are deeply rooted in social and economic factors.
So he's saying that where you live, how much money you make, what kind of access you have to healthcare, all of that plays a role in your risk of developing these chronic diseases.
Precisely. He's highlighting the social determinants of health.
And to illustrate this point, he uses a specific example, right?
Yeah, he talks about Blackpool in England. It's
Yeah.
a town that's experienced a lot of economic hardship, and health disparities are very pronounced there.
Meaning that certain groups of people are much more likely to suffer from these chronic diseases than others.
Right. Kennedy points to factors like unemployment, poor housing conditions, limited access to healthy food options. All of these things contribute to higher rates of heart disease, diabetes, and other chronic illnesses among Blackpool residents.
It's a stark reminder that our health is not solely determined by our individual choices, but is profoundly shaped by the social and economic conditions in which we live.
Absolutely. And this brings us to the HIV/AIDS pandemic, which further underscores this connection between disease inequality and global health disparities.
The HIV/AIDS pandemic was a global crisis that really exposed the stark inequities in access to healthcare and treatment.
It did. Kennedy highlights the devastating impact of HIV/AIDS on sub-Saharan Africa, where limited access to prevention testing and treatment led to a disproportionate burden of disease.
And he contrasts that with the experience of wealthier nations, where the development of antiretroviral therapies significantly improved the prognosis for people living with HIV/AIDS.
It's a clear example of how socioeconomic factors and global power dynamics influence who gets sick and who has access to life-saving interventions.
Yeah, it really highlights those global inequalities, doesn't it?
It does. And this theme of inequality is even more apparent when you look at the COVID-19 pandemic, which Kennedy argues exposed the vulnerabilities of our interconnected world and really exacerbated existing disparities.
The COVID-19 pandemic definitely showed us how unprepared we were for a global health crisis of that magnitude.
Right. And it also brought to light the uneven distribution of resources and the challenges of, coordinating a global response to a rapidly spreading disease.
Absolutely. I mean, even something as basic as testing was not readily available in many parts of the world early on.
And then there was the whole issue of vaccine access. Kennedy actually uses the term vaccine apartheid to describe how wealthier countries hoarded vaccines, leaving many low-income nations struggling to protect their populations.
It's a pretty stark term, but it does capture the reality of the situation.
Yeah, it does. It's a reminder that even in the face of a global crisis, self-interest and national priorities often take precedence over international cooperation and equitable distribution of resources.
It's a bit disheartening, isn't it?
It is. But, Kennedy's overall message is not one of despair. He actually ends his book on a somewhat hopeful note. He reminds us that the threat of pandemics is not a thing of the past. It's an ongoing challenge in our increasingly interconnected world.
He does paint a rather unsettling picture of a future where we're constantly facing the threat of new and emerging infectious diseases.
He does. He argues that factors like globalization, environmental degradation, and climate change are creating conditions that are ripe for the emergence and spread of novel pathogens. As we encroach on natural habitats and disrupt ecosystems, we increase the likelihood of zoonotic spillover events.
Zoonotic spillover, meaning when a pathogen jumps from an animal to a human.
Exactly. And it's not just about bad luck, it's about the choices we make as a species. Our actions have consequences, and those consequences can include an increased risk of pandemics.
So what does Kennedy suggest we do about it?
Well, he urges us to move beyond reactive responses to outbreaks and adopt a more proactive approach. He advocates for greater investment in public health infrastructure, enhanced disease surveillance systems, and robust international collaboration. Basically, we need to be prepared for the next pandemic before it hits.
So it's about shifting from a reactive mindset to a preventative one.
Exactly. And it's not just about developing new vaccines and treatments, it's about addressing the underlying social and economic factors that make people more vulnerable to disease in the first place.
So things like poverty, inequality, lack of access to healthcare.
Right. Those are all factors that contribute to poor health outcomes. And until we address those issues, we're always going to be playing catch up.
He also talks about this need to move away from this war on germs mentality, right?
Yes. He argues that we need to shift our thinking and recognize that pathogens are part of our ecosystem. We can't just try to eradicate them. We need to find ways to coexist with them while minimizing their impact on human health.
So it's about finding a balance.
Exactly. And it's about learning from history. There have been successful public health interventions in the past, things like sanitation improvements, vaccination campaigns. Those have dramatically reduced the burden of infectious diseases.
And those successes weren't just about scientific advancements, right? They're also about social and political will. It took a collective effort to prioritize public health, invest in infrastructure, and address inequalities.
It did. And I think that's a key takeaway from Kennedy's book. Our response to pathogens can't just be technological. It has to be social and political as well. It requires collaboration, empathy, and a commitment to collective action.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into pathogenesis, what's the one thing you want our listeners to really think about?
Well, Kennedy asks this really profound question at the end of his book.
Yeah.
He says, what does it mean to live with decency in a world shaped by pathogens?
That's a big question.
It is. It's a question that forces us to think beyond mere survival. It's about our values, our responsibilities, our shared humanity in the face of these invisible threats.
It's call to action, isn't it?
It is. It's a call to consider how we organize our societies, how we prioritize our resources, how we treat each other. Because in a world where infectious diseases are an ever-present reality, those are the questions that really matter.
I think that's a great place to end this deep dive. It's been a fascinating journey through the history of infectious diseases, and it's definitely given us all a lot to think about.
It has. And I want to thank you for guiding us through this complex topic. You've done a fantastic job.
Thank you. And thank you to our listeners for joining us today. We hope you found this exploration of pathogenesis insightful and thought-provoking.
And if you'd like to delve deeper into this topic, we encourage you to pick up a copy of Jonathan Kennedy's book. It's a truly eye-opening read.
And of course, if you enjoyed this deep dive, be sure to subscribe to our show for more captivating journeys into the world of knowledge and ideas.
We'll see you next time. There's a link to buy the book in the episode description.